All right, good afternoon. I'm Brandy Ward, Research Associate with REL Central, and I will serve as the facilitator for today's REL Central Bridge event, Building a Better Survey. I will begin with a little information about the Regional Education Laboratory serving the Central Region, who is sponsoring today's Bridge event, and then introduce the presenters. Due to the number of participants, we have muted everybody upon their entrance into this webinar. You have access to the question function, which will allow you to ask any questions or let us know of any difficulties you might be having. We will gather all of the questions that you ask us, and we will be sure that the presenters receive these questions so that they can respond either during the presentation or at the conclusion of the webinar. If you are having difficulties, feel free to send those into the question box too, and we will do our best to assist you. This Bridge event will be recorded and posted to the REL Central website, which is www.relcentral.org, within a few hours following today's presentation, along with the slides and any additional resources mentioned in today's presentation. So a little bit more information about the Regional Education Laboratory. It's at Marzano Research, which is an education laboratory funded by the U.S. Department of Education, serving 7 states, including Colorado, Kansas, Missouri, Nebraska, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Wyoming. We help educators translate research into policy and practice through providing technical assistance to states and districts. We also conduct research that address regional priorities and share research findings with the broader community. Our work is driven by research alliances, which are groups of stakeholders organized around a specific topic who share information, conduct research, analyze results, and communicate findings. To find out more information about our research alliances, you can also visit our website, about our states. So the 7 research alliances that we have are around educator effectiveness, formative assessment, rural education, Native American education, mathematics and science, systems development and improvements, and then also college and career readiness. So our research work is educator focused while meeting the rigorous standards for scientifically based research. Educators can ask simple questions via the Ask a REL service, which is on our website, or they can join research alliances to share information about particular research topics, or actively participate in research studies and projects. Peer review reports and analytic tools are continually produced from our REL Central research work. And we also hold a variety of webinars and in-person meetings throughout the year. Our webinars are available for anybody in the region to attend and are also archived on our website. So now moving on to today's Bridge events, there are 4 goals that we would like to cover with you. First is to introduce reliability and validity for survey instruments, and to provide insight into the characteristics of good survey items. Another goal is to introduce the concept of cognitive interviews and to discuss ways to test for reliability and validity. So this webinar will begin with Dr. Ellen Mandinach. Ellen is a senior research scientist and the director of the Data for Decisions initiative at WestEd and is a leading expert in the area of data-driven decision-making at the classroom, district, and state levels. Her work over the past decade has focused on understanding how educators are using data to inform practice. She has written and spoken widely on the topic and has served on a number of technical working groups and advisory boards on data use. She authored a number of publications for academic journals, technical reports, and 4 books. Her most recent book, Transforming Teaching and Learning Through Data-Driven Decision-Making, is a volume that will help educators to make better use of data. She received an A.B. in psychology from Smith College and a Ph.D. in educational psychology from Stanford University. Dr. Lynn Swackhamer and Dr. Michael Culbertson will also be co-presenting today. Lynn is a research associate at RMC Research in Denver, Colorado. She has worked on a variety of research and evaluation projects, and her areas of expertise include quantitative research, mixed methods research designs, curriculum development, and school improvement. She is also a team member on several Central States Research Education Laboratory technical assistance projects within the 7-state region, and also the co-lead of the Systems Development and Improvement Research Alliance, which we refer to as SDIRA. Sadira focuses on systems and the processes therein at the school district and state level. Lynn earned her Bachelor of Business Administration from North Georgia State College and University in Georgia. She received her MA in Curriculum and Instruction and her PhD in Educational Leadership and Innovation from the University of Colorado, Denver. Michael is a research associate of RNC Research Corporation in Denver also. Michael has extensive expertise in quantitative research design and analysis, including instrument development, psychometrics, and advanced statistical analysis. He also has experience with mixed methods research and program theory-based evaluation. Michael is also a team member of REL Central and is on the Technical Evaluation Assistance in Mathematics and Science project, which we refer to as TEAMS, which provides technical assistance to evaluators of National Science Foundation math science partnerships. Michael completed his PhD in educational psychology at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He also holds an MS in statistics from the University of Illinois and an Ed.M. in international educational development from Boston University. So as you can see on your screen, today's presentation is in 4 parts: what makes a good survey item, cognitive interviews, reliability and validity, and using exploratory and confirmatory factor analysis. So without further ado, here is Ellen to begin today's Bridge event, Building a Better Survey.
Thanks so much. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to begin with the issue of survey items, and I want to recommend to all of you a book that is called Scale Development, Theory and Applications. It's published by SAGE, and it's by R.F. DeVillis. It's a 2012 publication. It's an excellent source of information about scaling. Now, given the introduction that I just got, people are probably saying, why? She's a data person. Well, in a former life, I was trained in educational measurement, and it was a long time ago. So in preparation for this presentation and webinar, I was able to renew my interest in areas that have gone far away from my area of focus now. So thank you to REL Central for this opportunity. In terms of developing a scale, what this is about is measures or scales are composed of a collection of items that form a composite score, which is a combination of scores that reflects a particular construct or phenomenon of interest. So you move from a number of items to scales and ultimately to a measure. So in this view, what you have, and we could work left to right or right to left, typically you begin with a construct of interest, and in this case, perhaps self-esteem, anxiety, school performance, whatever it might be, and then you begin to develop particular items that reflect that construct of interest. So several items, certainly more than one to give reliability, and a scale is a composite of those particular items, and ultimately they work up with several scales that make or comprise a full measure. So you can see that it works left to right as well as right to left in the way they are constructed. So, oops, sorry about that. I love the graphics on this, so thank you to REL Central for figuring out a way to communicate the difference between validity and reliability. At the left, you can see that all the arrows are in one spot, but they're off target. That means that they're reliable. They're doing something consistently, but in this case, they're not valid because they haven't hit the target area, which is the phenomenon of interest. Whereas in the center, you have, you've hit the bullseye. These arrows indicate that the measure is both reliable and valid. It's measuring the construct of interest, and it's consistent in its measurement. And then the depiction on the right, you see that there is unreliability and therefore an invalid measure because neither do you have consistency nor have you hit your target of the construct of interest. An interesting way to depict the differences between reliability and validity. DeVillis comes up with a very good definition of what a latent variable is. Because when you're developing a scale, you have a construct, and what you're trying to do is measure the latent variables. It's the underlying phenomenon or construct that a scale is intended to reflect. And this really is the heart of validity of measurement. So in the depiction that you have in front of you now, and this is just an example of, in this case, what determines happiness, latent variables are considered the characteristics of the individual who is the source of the data at hand. They cannot be observed, and they cannot be quantified directly. They are considered latent, not manifest, and are variable and not constant. I hope that makes sense, and we can reiterate that as we go forward and certainly take any questions on that. The variables have a specific value under specific conditions. An item or a scale is developed to measure the magnitude of the variable, and there is an assumed relationship or correlation between the two. Hope that makes sense. Using a slightly different depiction, in this case, parental aspiration for children's achievement as an example, you might have items that say, my child's achievements are determined by my success, or no sacrifice is too great to ensure my child's success. This is getting at the latent variable through items that try and approximate what that variable or phenomenon means. In terms of scale development, we have several guidelines for you, and again, Devalis is very helpful in the provision. The first is to determine clearly what you want to measure, and fundamentally, this has to be grounded in a theory of action, specificity of what it is you're measuring, and being clear what you're excluding from measurement and what you are including from measurement. Then there is the generation of an item pool. You need to select items that reflect the given construct or phenomenon of interest. Redundancy can be both a good thing and a bad thing, the number of items that would be included there. You have to consider the number of items, and there's no set rule of how many items are good. You need enough items to make it reliable. You don't want to overwhelm with too many items because then it will be redundant. You need to think about the writing process of these items. Yeah, I worked at Educational Testing Service for a number of years, and I know the item writers there struggle mightily in their writing process to make it unbiased and to have good writing that gets at the phenomenon. There are a number of issues around what consists of a good or a bad item, and there are issues around length, difficulty, ambiguity, the semantics, the syntax that's used, double-barreled questions, and pronouns. So many of these things need to be considered as you're writing items. And also you need to balance both negative and positive items, because if they're all skewed in one direction, people can get into a response mode, and that's not a good thing. They'll just keep clicking through. Another guideline is to determine the format for measurement, and there are many things to consider here. Scaling issues of what sort of scale are you using? How are they to be weighted? What are the response categories? So how many, if you're using a fixed response, are you using 2, 3, 4? Are you using other, not applicable, don't know, those sorts of things? Are you using a format such as Likert scales, semantic differentials, item time frames, and the like? So all of those need to be determined as guidelines for developing a scale and the items within. And finally, in this slide at least, to have an initial item pool reviewed by experts, expert in the content area and experts in measurement, to make sure that you've done an adequate job of representing the phenomenon of interest and done a good job from the standpoint of educational measurement. Some additional guidelines, and I know this is throwing a lot of things at you, but I know that REL Central will be providing the PowerPoints to those people, and we're happy to answer any questions, is the consideration of inclusion of validation items. such as social desirability scale. You want to make sure that not everything in there is simply something said because you feel that it's the right thing to say. Another thought guideline is to administer items to a developmental sample. Have a small sample, a representative sample, from which you can determine how good the scale is, what needs to be revised. You get some initial descriptive statistics about it, and then you can do a final version. You need to evaluate the items. Evaluation is through an examination of the item performance. This can get very, very complex in terms of statistical properties. Simply, you can do factor analyses, and you can use Cronbach's alpha to determine internal consistency. Those are pretty much the most basic statistics that could be applied. And then to determine the optimal length of scale. And there's, as I said, there's really no good way to do this. You can do that through split samples. You can tinker with the scale length. You will consider dropping off what you consider bad items through statistics, or even through what I call the interocular test. You eyeball and say, you know, this item just isn't working. It doesn't measure what it's supposed to. Or does the item through the alpha determine that there's an impact on the length in terms of reliability. So let me pause there and ask the folks at REL Central whether there are any looming questions before we move on to the next part of the session.
Thanks, Ellen. Yeah, we do have a few questions that I think we have time for. One of them is, if you're using a Likert scale, is there an optimal number of response categories?
There's a lot of debate about that one. That's a really good question. Some people don't like the middle category, so they want to go to evens. So highly disagree to strongly disagree with lessers in the middle. Some want a neutral. It really depends on the purpose of your measurement and what you want to get out of it. 3 may be too little. 7 may be too much. I tend to go with 5, with strongly disagree, a neutral response, agree, and strongly agree. But again, that's a personal decision.
All right. Thank you. Another question just came in that I will ask. So if you use social desirability items and the person fails, so to speak, what do you do with their data? Do you throw it out altogether?
Well, I think what you're using for, at least in piloting the instrument, is to determine whether you have items in there that will cause people, like, something like, I beat my child, or something like that. That a socially desirable answer is, of course you don't. So you need to come up with a wording of, and it's the same way that attorneys ask questions, and that may be not a good thing as an example, but you want to phrase questions in a way that will avoid just simply getting a socially desirable answer, so that you can get to people who may say something on the more negative side. If it's too socially desirable, it may not give you the information, and you may indeed want to drop it out.
Great. And I think we have time for another one, which I'll ask. So should survey items be phrased as statements to which respondents rate their degree of agreement? And is there any research on that?
It's been a while since, so I don't know about the research. There are a number of ways of phrasing it. It can be as a statement with agreement, disagreement, or it can be asked as a question with yes, no. And again, it depends on how you want to scale the items and the kinds of information that you want to gather. So for any sort of measurement, it really comes down to the validity question of what is the phenomenon you're measuring, and how best to ask the questions to attain information about that. So that's really the information that I would want to pass along. Certainly there are caveats in all directions to answer that question.
All right, well thanks Ellen. Those were all the questions that we've had so far.
Okay, so I guess we're ready to move on to the next section. And let me, which is conducting cognitive interviews. And a lot of these are somewhat disjointed, but they really all fall together in ways of trying to get information about different phenomena in different manners. A cognitive interview is really a method of eliciting responses to provide indications of an individual's knowledge, cognitive behavior, skill sets, level of understanding, ability, performance level. So a number of phenomena can come from this. It's a process of really inferring thought based on observation of behavior and indicators of performance. And so, again, it depends. An example would be doing a think aloud protocol with the student to understand how the child is solving a mathematics problem, or observing someone in some sort of behavioral pattern to understand if they're doing things right or making diagnosis about how things can be remediated. So the best resource, and this goes back to the dark ages, we're going back to 1984 with Erickson and Simon. Herb Simon, the professor from the University of Pittsburgh who won the first Nobel Prize in the area of economics, but he was a psychologist. The assumption here is that cognitive processes can be generated through verbalizations, and they're a subset of cognitive processes that generate any kind of recordable response or behavior. I strongly urge you to try and find a copy of the book because it's very helpful. It's the best resource I know on these kinds of methods. So think aloud protocols and interviewing. What happens there is that a cognitive process is done through verbalization directly by a student, a subject, an individual. So it may be a teacher listening to a student talk about how they solve a problem. The individual is explicitly instructed to think aloud while solving the problem, assignment, or task. An observer, usually the teacher or the experimenter, will record the responses of what is said, done, using an analytic tool. Now it's very easy using an iPad or a notebook to do that, to understand what has happened in the performance, what are the performance's strengths and weaknesses, what are the strategies and processes that the student or subject has used in that process of solving the problem. And I've used it a number of times. I find it really interesting. I find it very informative. Of course, there are many pros and cons to it, just like any technique, and we'll go into that later. A second technique is called retrospective reporting. And what happens here is that it's about a memory trace that is articulated upon completion of a task. So this is retrospective. It's after the fact rather than while it's happening, as in a think aloud process. The third method is a verbal probing technique. And here what happens is you probe for additional information based on an additional question posed to a survey taker or someone who is doing a task. The probes can attempt to elicit more specific information, indicators of understanding, misunderstanding, the skills and knowledge. So really trying to get at more in-depth information than simply letting them do their thing on their own. This could be about having them paraphrase something, recall something, provide specifics about what they've done, or to have them describe how they comprehend or interpret the performance. And again, pros and cons of all of these. So for example, pros and cons in think aloud protocols. There's a limitation. There could be an interviewer or teacher bias in some way. A teacher thinks that a child may know more or less than really is happening, or an experimenter sort of overinterprets what is happening. A con for this is that it requires minimal training on the part of the teacher or the experimenter. And it's very open-ended, so you get a lot of information, perhaps in some ways too much information. On the negative side, there's a concern about whether the student or subject is doing something that is not typical. And so you don't have a representative sample of the behavior simply because of the response mode that's happening. You may have resistance from the student or the subject. I don't want to do that. They're not willing to participate, or they may stray from the task. In terms of this, asking somebody to think about what they're doing and articulate it as they're doing does place an extra cognitive burden on the individual. So we have to be careful that you're not putting somebody into cognitive overload as you're asking them to do such a performance. In terms of the retrospective reporting, it's a close approximation as you might get. Even though it is retrospective in the past, it is a close approximation to what they're doing and having them recall it. But unfortunately, there are also a number of cons to this. There is additional processing because they have to retrieve through memory what's happened, so there may be retrieval issues. There may be interference in memory. There may be inferences from memory that are inaccurate. It depends on the interval of recall. The longer you wait to have them do the retrospective, the more interference there will be in that recall. So the quicker you can have them do it, the better it is. However, there could be also inaccuracies in short-term memory. Some people are not very aware of what they've done, so they can't even articulate it even after they've done it. So the whole area of being retrospective can be fraught with problems. In terms of verbal probing, there are two very good pros to it. You can control the testing questions by what are the questions you ask, and there is a limited requirement on the part of the subject or the student of what you're requiring them to do through this because they can either answer the question or they can't answer the question. In terms of the negative aspects of it, it is somewhat artificial, and you can impose some potential bias. But again, you have to weigh the pros and cons of what information you're trying to elicit through the survey or the probing of the individual. So in terms of summing up about cognitive interviewing, there's a very long history of its use in cognitive psychology. People like Herb Simon used it for many years and in fact won a Nobel Prize around some of his work. Teachers have been using it. Psychologists in general have been using it for a very long time. You have inferences that are based on true observations of students or subjects and their articulations. So making a good reporting of those articulations is absolutely essential to get the accuracy of what has occurred. You can make generalizations about the cognitive processes that are being used, but to some limitation. Again, the issue of, is this atypical behavior or typical behavior will influence the level of generalizability there. Through any sort, introspection, recall, recognition, there's an awareness that comes into play both for the student subject and for the experimenter or teacher. These introspections may actually help a student think more deeply about what he or she is doing and help them to diagnose strengths and weaknesses and improve their performance. And then there's an issue of coding. You need to have a coding scheme for how you're going to handle the data. It is better to do that a priori than post hoc. That way it diminishes the possibility of bias after you've already collected the data. And then in doing the protocol analyses, again, a rubric for developing those protocols and how you're going to analyze the data. All of these are absolutely essential. And one final is the interpretations. To be very careful not to overgeneralize and overstate the case, but to be cautious about what implications and what interpretations you're making on the data that you have collected. So for those of you who are interested in this, as I said, it's been around for a long time. Protocol analysis, verbal reports as data. I know you can get a version online. I still have my copy that's very dog-eared from using it a lot. It's a great resource for people. I'll pause there, turn it over to the REL Central people for any questions on this part of the presentation.
All right, thanks, Ellen. We do have one question so far, and if anybody else has questions on this section, please feel free to type it in the question box. But what do you typically use as your cognitive interview technique? Do you have a preferred method, and if so, what are the benefits that you found through your own experience?
With the kind of work I've done, I prefer the Think Aloud protocols because, or at least in a former life when I was doing this kind of work, I like the Think Aloud protocol, particularly in working with students on complex problems, because it helps me to understand the processes and the steps that they are using in solving the problem, and then helps me to understand where their learning deficits are, where they're having trouble, struggling, so that it can help to remediate those problems. But again, it depends on the kinds of questions you're asking. When working with students, I find that interesting, and in fact, I would suspect that good teachers have been using a form of this technique for a very long time, and particularly now with formative assessment, that one could consider that aspect part of Think Aloud. And it's not just about what they're doing in the process, but looking at body language. So is a child engaged? Are they asleep? Are they rolling their eyes? Are they getting what they're doing? So for me, Think Aloud protocols, definitely.
All right, thanks. Another question that I'll ask is, what are some strategies that you have or know of for building a better survey for cross-cultural use?
Ouch, good question. Well, I'll take from my experience at ETS that the more eyes you can have on it, and a place like ETS or ACT or any of the big test developers use something called diff analysis, which is a statistical procedure to look at the difference in performance of different groups, so whether it's male, female, different ethnic groups, different language groups, to see if an item is potentially biased against any of those. For smaller scale, you're not going to be able to do diff analysis, but I would bring in a group of diverse individuals to look at items to see if there is a potential bias. So for example, if you're asking a question, and I'll use a simple one, about farm animals, kids in urban areas, particularly in in really densely parts of the country, may not have had much experience with cows where rural kids might. Or if you ask something about an escalator and kids are not familiar with that, or language differences, like the word purse may be a handbag somewhere else, it may be a pocketbook somewhere else. So being very careful about the wording and the availability of whatever you're asking in general culture and familiarity. So those sorts of issues really are raised when it comes to cross-ethnic, it's diversity.
All right, thanks, Ellen. Those were all the questions we have right now. We did get one in the last section, but I'll save that towards the end. So I think we're ready to move on.
Okay. Let me forward. Okay. Now we're moving into reliability and validity. I'll be doing the first part and then passing it over to Lynn for the validity part. In terms of validity, you might think about, and this is a definition that comes from Anne Anastasi, and again going back to the Dark Ages for this definition, the consistency of scores obtained by the same person when re-examined with the same test on different occasions or with different sets of equivalent items or under other variable examining conditions. And let me say this again. The consistency of scores is the key issue here. And that could be done through various methods. So it's about, is your measurement consistent over time and with the same sorts of items? So for example, in this you have measures of student performance that need to be consistent. Under the same circumstances, the obtained scores would be similar. That's the fundamental premise of reliability, and it is highly important. So I'm going to get a little bit more technical here, and I know when we get to the validity section it will get even more technical. So hopefully not too much, because we don't really want to go to measurement 202 but make this measurement 101. In terms of reliability, it's intimately related to the error of measurement and true scores. The farther away of something being inconsistent, the more error of measurement is impacted, and the true score comes into play about it. Reliability indicates fluctuation that's likely to occur in a student's score as a result of irrelevant and chance factors. Again, that comes to inconsistency rather than consistency of measurement. It's about the true differences and the extent to which they are attributable to chance error as opposed to the measurement. So if it's chance, it's going to impact the reliability of your measurement. It's about reliability at the very basic level is about the concept of correlation. So if you have two equivalent tests, you give that, you want them to be highly correlated. If you're measuring a different phenomena, they're going to be less correlated. So in terms of foundational concepts, and this went to a question earlier on, longer tests yield better reliability. So the more items you have, the more reliable a scale or a measure is going to be. If you're only using one item, you don't have anything against which to compare. 2 is better than 1, and more is better than fewer. And I don't have a good answer to how much is too much, other than to not overburden the test taker. The larger the sample of behavior or performance, the more adequate or consistent the measure is going to be. These are fundamental. Longer is better, and larger sample will give you more consistency in measurement. So in terms of reliability, there are a couple of different types to be aware of. The first is test-retest, and that's pretty simple. You're giving the same test twice. It shows the extent to which scores can be generalized over different occasions. The higher reliability, the less susceptible the scores are to the randomness of daily circumstances. You may have practice effects there if you're using exactly the same test given twice. There's an issue of the interval between. That if it's too close, there may be immediate recall. If it's too far away, there may not be any connection. And the final one is that the nature of the test may change with repetition. So again, there are pros and cons to this as well. In terms of alternate form reliability, what you've done is given the same person form A, for example, at time 1, and a comparable form, form B, at a second time. And the two forms of reliability deal with temporal stability and the consistency of the responses between the two forms. You have content sampling as an underlying principle. So if you've got alternate forms, you want to have the same topics roughly equivalent. You want to have the same difficulty roughly equivalent in both forms. You want to have the same number of items. Anytime your content coverage, the number of items, and the range of difficulty differ, then you really don't have an alternate form. You've got a different measure. Split half or internal consistency reliability is another form. What you've done is make comparable scores derived from the division of a measure into two comparable components, like taking two parts of the same test. It eliminates temporal issues because you're doing a single administration, and you have issues of dealing with the level of difficulty there, how you actually split up the test, because in some tests the harder ones come later, so you have to be very careful about how you split it up. And Cronbach's alpha very much attends to this through the internal consistency of taking away certain items and what that does to the reliability estimate. A final one is inter-rater reliability. And here with inter-rater reliability, you have more than one individual rating something, typically with observation, and the degree of agreement among those raters is the inter-rater reliability. Again, an issue here is making sure that the raters are trained appropriately so that they can do the same kind of observation or rating on the same rubric, the same scale, the same metric. So here are your four kinds, pros and cons to all of them, as I've just mentioned: alternate form, test-retest, split half, and inter-rater. And again, we're going back to the Dark Ages. For good references, I strongly recommend two books. The one that is more readable is Ann Anastasi's book, Psychological Testing. There probably is a more recent version, even though she's deceased, and Cronbach's Essential of Psychological Testing. Cronbach was my advisor. I know his book inside and out, but I find that that one is more difficult and much more technical in terms of the fundamentals of measurement. So either one is good. Anastasi is more readable. Lynn, I guess it's over to you for validation.
Okay, thank you, Ellen. So what is validity? We talked a little bit about it earlier, but now we're going to go into it a little deeper. So it's basically the degree to which a tool measures what it claims to measure. And one good analogy that's been around for a long time is think of a bathroom scale. So you weigh yourself every day and it gives you the same number. So it's reliable. But if that number isn't your true weight, then it's not valid. So that's what we want to make sure that we're measuring the true thing. I don't seem to have control. Megan, I need control. Okay.
Lynn, try again. I gave it to you already.
Okay, thank you. It's just not doing anything.
There you go.
Okay, all right. Sorry about that. So why is validity important? Validity, we're concerned with whether the scale scores are the true source of the phenomenon that we're studying. And where reliability will tell us that the items work together to give us a score, the validity tells us that the score matches the construct of interest. And while a construct can have many related constructs, such as if we said self-efficacy was our construct we're interested in, it could be also related to self-esteem. So there's going to be other constructs around that kind of connect to your construct, but you really want to really drill in and try to measure only the construct that you are studying. There are three types of validity that we're going to talk about. The first is content validity. And to address content validity, we always have to ask ourselves, does the content of the items accurately reflect the underlying construct? In this case, let's think we're doing a scale on math anxiety. So do each of these items really measure math anxiety, or are they measuring something else? To really test this, we're going to get an expert, 1, 2, 3, how many you could find, that really know a lot about math anxiety, and we're going to give them our items, and they're going to give us some good feedback on whether they're measuring what we want them to measure. So that's content validity. Criterion validity we're looking at the relationship between a scale score and an outcome. So sometimes we're interested in predictive validity. We want to know whether our scale may predict something that occurs after we measure our scale. So for example, we could be interested in whether our math anxiety score predicts success later on in college algebra. To measure this, we would look at the correlation between math anxiety scores and college algebra scores within the same population of people. If we're interested in whether the scale is predictive of something that is occurring at the same time as our measure, we call that concurrent validity. And in this example with math anxiety, if we were interested in whether those scores predict grades in the student's current math course, that would be concurrent. Then we also have construct validity, which is what we'll be going into later on. It looks at whether, looks mathematically at whether the scale is truly measuring what it states. In our case, we might say that we're measuring math anxiety, but we want to look at it mathematically and see, is it truly holding together? We can do that externally and internally. Externally, we could look at convergent validity. And there's a lot of terms I know, but you will get all our notes in our PowerPoint. So how does our scale of math anxiety, is it correlated with other people's scales that measure, purported to measure math anxiety? So we give both types of tests, and then we look to see if they're highly correlated. Then we could say, yes, it does have convergent validity. It must be measuring math anxiety. We can also do discriminant validity. So we have our math anxiety, and we know that there's this other construct that's kind of similar but not really. So we give a test of that along with our math anxiety, and that way we want them to be not very highly correlated. And if they're not, then we can say, okay, we truly are measuring math anxiety and not this other related construct. For our internal structure, we typically look at factorial validity. And we use factor analysis to look at the internal structure to determine if they hold together to form a scale that explains variance in scale scores. So it's all about, are we explaining variance? So we're going to be looking at that method in the next section. But now we have time for any questions related to reliability and validity. And Ellen and I can both try to answer these.
All right, thanks, Lynn. Ellen, you kind of touched on this, but I'll ask it anyway. How many items are too many items? You said that longer tests yield better reliability and to not overburden the test taker, but is there a rule of thumb for that?
I think it goes to the validity question. I could actually hand this off as a question to Lynn as well to see if we have convergence here or inter-rater reliability. Too few is not good. Too many is also not good because the fundamental premise here is that you want to have enough items to measure the construct of importance here. If you have too many, you're going to overburden, as I said, the test taker or the respondent to the survey. And if you have too few, you may not have adequate coverage about the construct or the subconstructs of interest. So I think you have to make sort of a good learned guess or estimate about how many is enough based on how complex the construct or the domain is that you are trying to measure. Lynn, do you have any feelings on this?
Yeah, well, this is exactly why I love factor analysis, because you can get a whole pool of items and you can look at the factor structure and the reliability using different combinations and look at which items are not good. So that way you can kind of really narrow in on what's the ideal number of items to give you good explanation of variance and reliability. So I always start out bigger and then try to weed them down till you have a great parsimonious number of items that will actually measure what you want them to measure.
Thanks, Lynn. We did get another question. So if I'm using a test that has known high reliability, but with my sample, I'm not getting that high reliability. How much should I pay attention to this?
That's also a good question. I mean, when a test taker does the psychometric evaluation of the test, they try and use a broad sample of people. So not getting a high reliability coefficient on the particular sample may indicate that the test may be less appropriate for that particular sample. Again, it depends on how much lower, and again, there's no rule of thumb. You know, it really depends on the purpose. So in this case, I would wonder whether the sample on which the instrument is being used really is very, very different, and therefore it's not just a reliability issue, but becomes a validity issue as well.
All right, thanks. And then I think we have time for one more that just came in. Are there any guidelines for what sort of evidence represents enough or good evidence of validity?
I'll go ahead with that. That's a very good question. I'm trying to think. I know there are. I don't have that in front of me, but I know there are definitely some guidelines that gives you kind of a benchmark of what you should be looking for each of the different types of validity. Like I said, I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but yes, there is research on that.
All right, I think those are all the questions we have so far. Keep them coming and we'll make sure that we ask them at the end, but moving on to part 4.
Okay, so we're going to talk a bit. This is going to be the really technical part, but I'm going to try to make it more relatable. We're first going to talk about exploratory factor analysis and then confirmatory factor analysis. So factor analysis explores the relationship among variables with the intention of creating a smaller set of variables. So you come up with all these items that you think are measuring this construct, and then the factor analysis will break those down into different smaller subconstructs that hopefully fit together to measure the main construct. So why do we use factor analysis? Well, as we said, we want to condense the individual items into a smaller number of variables because that helps us to increase our reliability and it forms our really strong construct validity. When we develop a survey to measure an underlying construct, say preparedness to teach or confidence in something, we generally use all those items and we think that we've come up with a lot that will capture it. But then the factor analysis helps us determine empirically how many constructs we have, our latent variables. When we use factor analysis, there's a lot of things that we have to consider. And this is ahead of the game before you start administering your survey. So first thing is sample size. Oops. Sorry, technical difficulties. All right, the first one is sample size. And there are so many different guidelines that people have put out talking about what is an adequate sample size in order to be able to run factor analysis. We've got, Gorsuch said you need at least 5 participants per variable. So let's say we have 10 items, we would need at least 50 people. Other people said, no, that's way too low. We need at least 10 people of variables. So they're saying you need at least 100 if you have 10 items. Other people say, no, 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 you got to have at least 300 participants before you're even getting close to having enough. Another group of people, McCallum, Witteman, Zhang, and Hong, conducted a Monte Carlo study, and they decided that sample size wasn't really a function of the number of variables or items, but it's influenced to the extent in which factors are overdetermined, which means you have at least 3 to 4 items per construct. And you need to have high commonalities, which is the correlation within the items. So they're saying that you could have as low a number as 100 if you have really high commonalities and you're overdetermined. 200 would be needed if you're only moderately in any of those areas, and if you're really underdetermined and really low commonalities, then you may need 400 to 800, and even that might not be enough. So that's sample size. Then we need to think about our method of extraction. This is a screenshot of SPSS. So it's showing you there are a lot of different choices you have when you're trying to figure out how to extract build your factor analysis, basically. Some of the more common ones are principal components analysis, maximum likelihood, and principal axis factoring. Those three are typically the more go-to kinds of factor analysis. Principal components actually does things quite a bit differently from the other factor analysis concepts. So some people say that's not even a factor analysis, it's doing something differently. But the majority of people use principal axis factoring, and then maximum likelihood is really favored by statisticians because it can give you fit statistics, which will tell you how closely your model is actually measuring what you want to measure. So you got to think about what your method of extraction is going to be before you start doing any kind of analysis. Next, we need to talk about rotation. Okay, so with the factor structure, you're getting this initial correlation matrix, and comes out with factors, but then it's really hard to interpret. So statisticians a long time ago figured out that if they rotate all of these correlations and come up with a different structure, that's more accurate and it's easier to interpret. So the most common one used is Varimax, and that's an orthogonal rotation. So that means that in the second round of correlations, they're going to make everything at a 90-degree angle. So that's just that concept with that. The problem with orthogonal is your factors should not be correlated. And in the majority of what we do, we have factors that are correlated. So we're going to use an oblique rotation, which doesn't make the correlations fit that 90-degree angle. It lets them be less than that. The problem that why they want to do Varimax, you get one pattern and structure, can't think of the word. Anyway, you just get one output, and you're able to interpret that so much easier. With an oblique rotation, we get two different outputs, and we've got to look at two different ways, and that's why people tend to try to go with the easier way of the Varimax. So then we have to think about factor retention rules. We can't just keep every factor it comes up with, because it's going to, like in this example, it said there could be a potential of 33 factors. But so we want to look at different ways of figuring out what's the ideal number of factors to retain based on what our data is telling us. The first one that a lot of people have used is the eigenvalue is greater than 1. In your output, you're going to get these eigenvalues. So that's a good first step. You know, if you got factors that have those higher than 1, then we want to consider those. Also, there's a scree plot, which is what's on the screen right now. And it plots the eigenvalues, and you're looking for where it kind of becomes an elbow, where it's bending. Okay, if we see here, the elbow's bending between 4 factors and 5 factors. So we would say we would want to keep 4 factors. That's your scree plot. And there are a couple other different ways. One that's becoming really popular right now is called parallel analysis. So you create a random set of data that matches your data set and see how many factors that comes out with and compare it to what you have. So that's another method. And finally, you can also come down to just your reflection and what you know about your theory of what are the components. And if you, like in this case, if you felt strongly that that fifth factor should be there, that it's being measured, then you can argue that that fifth factor would. Or if you're thinking, I really only like the 3, I don't even like that fourth one, it's using your theory, you can stick to the 3. Okay, so I briefly talked about commonalities earlier. So it's just the proportion of variance of the variable that's accounted for by the factors. So you want these under extraction, you want those commonalities to be really high. Above 0.7 is really ideal. So we can see here we've got one that's 0.422. That is not great. So we would want to look at that item. The others are getting pretty close. This would be a decent value. But again, above 0.7 is really ideal. And then we look at how much variance is explained. So according to Stevens and then Gorsuch later on, they say that your factors extracted together should account for at least 75% of the variance that's out there. But what we found, study Henson and Roberts looked at this over, I can't remember how many, a long year period, maybe about 10 years. And so they looked at 60 different studies in the social sciences, and the average variance explained was only 52%. So some people say, can we ever really hit a 75% variance in social sciences? So you got to take that into account too. We try to hit that 75, but sometimes you're going to have to go with a 50% and say that's the best I'm going to be able to do. Okay. In the following slides, I'm going to look at the results of an actual principal axis factor analysis with an oblique rotation that we performed on data made available to us from the NSF-funded Examining Mathematics Coaching project. So we thank those people very much for letting us use their data for this purpose. All right, so this is going to get, look at your results. You're going to get a pattern matrix and you're going to get a structure matrix. The pattern matrix gives you a cleaner version of where all of your items are loading. As you can see in this first example, we have a very clean structure. We don't have any cross-loading. What I do is I set it to not show me anything below 0.40 because those are, we don't want those kind of loadings there. We need it to be above 0.40 at least. So you can see under factor 1, we're coming down here with really high coefficients, so that's really good. But then we get down to the TS4I, and that only has a loading of 0.412, which, as we just said, we want it above 0.4, but that's really close to 0.4, so we're going to get rid of that one probably. Then we have 2 other items that didn't have any loadings above 0.4, so those are also problematic. On the second page is the bottom half. That's showing us factor 3 and factor 4. We also had one item here, TS40, that also didn't have a loading on any of the factors. So by looking at this, we can see, okay, we've got some items that we may have to either tweak or get rid of, and that's kind of our struggle here. This is the structure matrix, and you can see now this is why people get really scared of this type of an oblique rotation. But it's not that scary when you look at it closer. You want to have, you can see all of our items on factor 1 still loaded really highly on that in the structure matrix. Yes, they had loadings on others, but that's just showing that they're correlated somewhat with those other factors. As long as you have a pretty high rating on one factor, then you're looking pretty good. We can see here that the TS4P and 4I again had problematic structure coefficients because they're almost equally correlational across the 4 factors. So again, just showing that those have some issues. And the other 2 that we had identified in our pattern structure show up here as also having problems. And now we're going to skip to confirmatory factor analysis with Michael.
Okay, thank you. So both exploratory and confirmatory factor analysis are based on the same underlying conception, that the survey items are related to a common set of factors. In EFA, we try to find the relationships between the items and the factors empirically based on the data in a set of relationships. There we go. Okay, so let's look a little bit more at the differences between EFA and CFA. In exploratory factor analysis, we're not going to make any assumptions about the factor structure, and the factor structure emerges from the data. In confirmatory factor analysis, we're going to test or compare known factor structures or hypothesized factor structures, something that we specifically say we want to see, is this structure correct, or supported by the data, I should say. And we can also use it to refine existing models. So you remember Lynn was talking about in exploratory factor analysis, we have to deal with its rotation. That's not an issue in confirmatory factor analysis. The rotation is in essence specified explicitly by the associations that we describe between the items and the underlying factors. And finally, about what the difference is, I'd say that we should always start with an exploratory factor analysis. Even if you have a very strong theory about the structure of your questionnaire, always start with an EFA because the results may surprise you. Then you can always compare the EFA results with your theory using confirmatory factor analysis. So in CFA, we're testing a hypothesized set of relationships between the items and the underlying factors. So the first step in CFA is to set up a model that encodes those relationships. Here I've got just a very simple survey that has I've shown 4 items. In principle, there would be more items than that. Those are shown by the squares, or the rectangles rather, at the bottom. And these rectangles represent items about teachers' knowledge and use of different pedagogical techniques, such as lectures or inquiry-based instruction. The circles here represent the hypothesized factors. Suppose we have a knowledge factor and a use factor. The first step in setting up the model is to connect the items to specific latent factors. Generally, each item will be connected to a single factor, since we want our subscales to be as clean as possible. But from a statistical perspective, this isn't strictly necessary, and you could have an item connected to multiple factors. Next, we have to set the scale for the factors. When we measure the length of something, we can choose inches or centimeters. When we ask someone a survey question, we can have them respond using a 4-point scale or a 10-point scale or what have you. Latent variables have no intrinsic scale, so it has to be specified. And there are 2 options. My preferred method is to set the variance of each factor to 1. The other option is to pre-specify the loading of one of the items per factor instead. You might set that to 1. Third, since in the social sciences, our factors are almost always correlations in our CFA model. Some software will do this for you automatically. In other software, you have to specify that you want the factors to be correlated. So it's important to check how your software is behaving. Here in the model, or the diagram, the correlations are represented with this curved double arrow. Finally, there may be some items that are related to one another due to something other than their common factor. For example, items may have similar content or contexts. In the example here, there are 2 items about lecture and 2 items about inquiry, but one of each of the pairs is related to knowledge and the other is related to use. We might expect these items, the lecture items and the inquiry items, to be correlated beyond their association with the knowledge and the use factors. To incorporate this possibility in the CFA model, we allow the error terms for the relevant items to be correlated. Otherwise, most CFA software was going to assume that the error terms for the observed variables are uncorrelated, which is generally what you want as the default. Okay, I suggested that the purpose of a CFA is to test or compare hypothesized models for the relationships between items and factors. This is done with fit statistics. There are many, many fit statistics that have been developed for CFA, and it's easy to go overboard. I'm going to show you 4 common statistics. 2 of them are absolute measures of fit, meaning that you can use them to talk about the fit of a single model. And the other 2 are relative measures of fit, meaning that you can only use them to compare to 2 models, or more than 2. So the first is RMSEA, that stands for the root mean square error of approximation. In this case, you'll get a number. If it's smaller, then that indicates better fit. And there's a generally accepted rule of thumb that says if it's less than 0.05, then that's considered adequate. The next one is also another absolute measure of fit. That's GFI, that's the goodness of fit index. Here, we want the number to be closer to 1. It's going to be less than 1, but the closer to 1 we get, the better the fit. And here, 0.95 is often considered to be adequate. The next two are relative measures of fit, AIC and BIC. AIC stands for CACE Information Criterion, and BIC Bayesian Information Criterion. And these can only be used to compare models. The number that you get has very little to do with anything except your specific data set. So you can't look at the number and say, oh, this is a good number. You have to just compare two numbers and for two different models. And the model that has a smaller number is considered to be the better model. So now, just a quick note on these two criteria for adequate fit. These general rules of thumb are like most rules of thumb in social science. They're commonly cited, but they're rather arbitrary. So use them as a guide, but not as a hard and fast rule. As I mentioned, CFA can be used to refine your existing models. This can be done in three ways. First, as we were just discussing, you can compare competing plausible models using your fit statistics. The second thing that you can do, that's if you have models that you already know and want to compare. The second thing is you might look at a given model and remove irrelevant items. You can remove items from factors if they appear to be irrelevant based on a walled test. This is kind of like the t-test of a regression coefficient. If the test for a given loading comes back as non-significant, then the item may not provide much information about the given factor, and you can get rid of it. The third thing that you can do based on the output that you'll get from the CFA software is to consider new paths or new associations between items and factors using something called modification indices. Without going into too much detail, these are basically estimates that these modification indices estimate the improvement in model fit that you might achieve by adding a new path to the model. So the wall test and the modification indices suggest changes to an existing model, which then becomes a new plausible model that you can estimate and compare with your existing models using those fit indices. Okay, I'm going to go through a very quick example, and I apologize that we don't have enough time to go into this example in detail. It's going to be rather fast, so I encourage you to go back through the slides afterward because it's going to be kind of a whirlwind. In the example that Lynn was mentioning earlier, there was a question about, in the EFA, about where to put item 4i. In the EFA, it loaded, but only somewhat moderately, onto the preparedness factor. You see the loading here is 0.4. But the theory for this survey suggested that this item was really about confidence, not about preparedness. We can use CFA to test two plausible models. One that has 4i loading onto the preparedness factor, like the EFA suggested, and the other that has 4i loading onto the confidence factor, like our theory suggested. So in the first model, here are the results with item 4i loading onto the preparedness factor, like the EFA suggested. Here in the upper right, you see that the standardized loading for 4i is pretty good, 0.66. But notice that one of the top modification indices in the middle of the left-hand column there indicates that, or suggests a path from confidence to item 4i. That's that third line there. And that's just like our theory suggested. So we have some evidence from this model that suggests maybe our theory is a little bit better than the EFA results in this case. So we can try model 2, which has item 4i loading onto the confidence factor, like our theory said. And here we see that the loading, if you look in the upper right-hand corner, the loading for 4i onto confidence is much higher. Now it's 0.74, indicating a stronger association with confidence than with preparedness in the previous model. We also see that the fit indices in the upper left have improved ever so slightly. And there's no modification index suggesting a connection between preparedness and the item. So the CFA seems to provide some evidence to support the theory that 4i, support the theory for item 4i over the EFA results. Now let's take a quick look at items 4a and 4c. These also load onto confidence. If you look at the loadings on the right hand column there, you see that the loadings aren't very high, 0.49 and 0.57. Also, the top modification indices in the lower left here suggest paths between the two items. In CFA, we usually don't use paths between items, but they would occur in a structural modeling or SEM context. This might suggest that items 4A and 4C have more to do with one another than with the other confidence items. Perhaps they should belong to their own new factor. So we can create a model with a fifth factor that puts items 4A and 4C onto that factor phi. And we see the loadings for these items improve dramatically. Now they're 0.7 and 0.9. We also have a modest improvement in the fit indices. This suggests that items 4A and 4C really don't belong in the confidence subscale. Since it isn't preferable to have just a two-item subscale, most likely these two items would be deleted from the questionnaire unless their content was of utmost importance. I'd like to leave with you with just 3 concluding thoughts about CFA. You may have noticed in these 3 models that we looked at that they didn't have acceptable RMSEA and GFI according to the common rules of thumb. This could mean that the entire factor structure is wrong. One possible interpretation. It's not very likely given the EFA results that we had. The other thing that could be causing the misfit, it could just be reflecting the fact that the items themselves are not normally distributed. CFA assumes normally distributed variables, but our survey items are typically discrete with a small number of categories, like 4 or 5. And these discrete items are very poorly approximated by a normal distribution. This is a bit less of a problem for 7-point scales. Earlier, Ellen was talking about how many scale points should you have, and she prefers 5-point scales. That's perfectly fine. 7-point scales are slightly more normally distributed in a CFA sense, but CFA is not the end-all be-all of everything. So these are just different considerations to take to think about when we're constructing our survey. The second thought, don't be a slave to your fit indices. Use them as a guide for making informed decisions, but don't make changes heedlessly or needlessly just to bump the last digit in your fit statistics. Finally, in everything you do for survey development, content is king. If statistics suggest something that doesn't make sense with the content of the items, then go with the content of the items, not the statistics. This may mean deleting items that don't fit with others in the subscale, or choosing not to add a path that a modification index is suggesting. These statistics are there just to guide your decisions, but you have to make those decisions holistically, considering what it is you're trying to measure.
All right, thanks, Michael. We had a few questions come in that related to your section. First of all, what statistical software did you use for the CFA? I believe the EFA analysis that Lynn presented, she used SPSS. Did you too also use SPSS?
That's an excellent question. I'm trying to remember what I used. I think I was using SAS for this particular example. But you can use, there's an add-on package to SPSS called AMOS, and you can do CFA in AMOS.
All right, and then another follow-up question for you, Michael. When 2 items correlate on the CFA, is there a reason why you might not eliminate one item and keep the other on the theorized scale?
That's an excellent option. It all depends on the, I would say it all depends on the content of the items. In principle, you don't want your items to be correlated with each other and not with the latent variable. So one option to prevent that scenario would be to get rid of one of the items and keep the other. In that case, I would probably keep the item that has the higher loading or is better correlated with the other items on the scale. That's a great choice.
All right. I have another question about loading. And this is either for you or Lynn. If an item loads on multiple factors, is there a rule of thumb for how different those loadings should be to keep it on one or the other?
I've always, if it comes down to theory, and I try to keep it on the highest, the one that it loads on the highest, but it is something to look at if you've got cross loadings that are pretty close. an indication that you should look at the item a little closer and see what you can do to it. What do you say, Michael?
Yeah, I would add on to that in general you want your items to load only onto one factor. If the loading on a second factor is higher than whatever threshold you're using in general, like some people use a 0.3 cutoff or 0.4 cutoff for loadings of their items before they say, hey, this just doesn't load at all, then I would really consider whether I want to keep that item because it's really muddying the waters between the two factors if those are two things I want to distinguish.
All right, and then I'm going to go backwards a little ways because we received a number of questions posed by participants during each section that we were unable to get to. But meanwhile, if you have any other questions, feel free to chat them in the question box, and we'll spend the next 10 minutes covering these questions. And then if we don't have time to get to everybody's questions, we will be able to post a document along with copies of the PowerPoint slides to our REL Central website, which is www.relcentral.org. But the next question is, somebody stated that they usually use Cronbox Alpha to test reliability. Is there any exception to doing this?
I guess that's the question for me. Cronbox Alpha is the one that is most recognized in the field to look at internal consistency and reliability. So there may be others, but in my opinion and many others, that's the way to go.
If I could just add something on to Ellen's answer, I agree that it's definitely the way to go. Everyone pretty much expects to see Cronbox Alpha. I would just caution you that Cronbox Alpha doesn't tell you anything about the dimensionality of your scale. So if you think that you'll need to use another tool like factor analysis to look to see if you just have one dimension or multiple dimensions in conjunction with your Cronbox Alpha.
All right. Another question we got had to do with the sample size. So I believe, Lynn, you said that there's some guidelines that there should be 10 people per item. Is that per item within one scale or per item across the whole survey?
Generally across the whole survey, because when you develop, I've seen cases where there have been different scales, completely different scales within a survey, and people have run a factor analysis on the individual aspects, but it's better to just run an overall factor analysis and see if those are really clearly coming out. So I would say all the items on the survey.
All right. Lynn, I think this is geared towards you, I believe. So a participant is designing a survey where they know what their latent variables will be, or that they know that their latent variables will be correlated. Would oblique rotation be the best option, or should they use Varimax or something else?
If your factors are correlated, highly correlated, then yes, you need to do oblique. And a lot of it I've run it both ways on different data sets just to compare. And a lot of times it comes out almost exactly the same, but it's still better to err on the side of the rules, and if you're correlated, you should do an oblique rotation.
Great. And then another question that was asked in the very beginning that we didn't have time for. So a participant has experience with negative items that have shown that they don't load well on resulting scales and reduce alphas. Can you say more about the need for including and developing negative items and their consistency?
You got that, Ellen? I can add in.
Go ahead, Lynn.
I was just going to say I personally don't like the use of not negative and positive items within the same survey. I think it's useful if you have a big, you know, like some of those mental health batteries that have like 100 or 150 items, then that can get, because then you get the people out of their response bias. But if you're doing a survey and you've got, you know, 25, 30 items, I don't find the need for them, and there's a lot of research out there that's saying that it confuses people, and it does reduce your alphas, and it can reduce your the way they load. one other thing is if you do have negative items, you need to make sure that you reverse code them before you do any of your factor analysis or reliabilities, or it will really destroy your reliability. But me, I don't like them. That's just me. Anybody else?
I'm good with your response.
Okay.
Thanks, Ellen. So another question that we received from our participant is it better to revise a problematic item or just remove it?
I would think that depends on how many items you have making up your scale. If it's a critical item, then you would want to revise it. If you have other items that are getting at kind of the same idea that you're trying to measure, I would say you could just get rid of it. So it's one of those it depends answers.
Yeah, along similar lines, I think if you're planning to do a pilot administration and before your main survey, then definitely create a longer survey than you're actually planning to administer so that you can have some room to get rid of some items and just choose the best voting items when you run into those cases.
Very good point.
All right, thank you. We have about 4 more minutes, so I will ask a few more questions. So Ellen, in your section in the very beginning, you mentioned sometimes people use double-barreled questions, there's syntax issues. Are there other common mistakes that you see people making when developing surveys?
Well, I think the double-barreled, the syntax, poor wording, loaded questions, the social desirability aspect, questions that are so abstract that people can't readily interpret them. So having as many eyes as possible to read and determine whether they are whether the item can be misinterpreted is a really good suggestion, rather than just having one set of eyes on them and say, okay, this item will work. So the more people who can weigh in and be critical of it will be helpful.
I want to just add, it's totally unrelated, but one final point I wanted to add in. If you want a survey, please look at what existing surveys are out there first. That should be your first step, is trying to find something that's already been tested and you know would probably work with your population. And then you can add or subtract depending on what, if you don't think it's quite measuring what you want. But it's better to start with a strong instrument than to just try to create everything out of your own head.
All right.
Right, you're more likely to get good.
Oops,
Sorry,
lost
Michael.
you there, Michael.
Oh.
Okay, so we have one more question. If I'm combining items from different previously published instruments and they use different scales, how do I decide on a single scale to be used? Example, strongly agree to strongly disagree, or does not help at all to helps very much? How would you advise that?
I know, sorry, I'm trying to think. Because I've done this, and within an instrument I have used different scales as long as you section them off. They can, I would probably prefer to try to change the item wording a little bit so they can all use the same scale. But if that's not possible, then I would just separate them within the survey. You have thoughts on that, Michael or Ellen?
I guess my concern is a response mode that people can get into just checking off the same old, same old. So I would say sectioning off is a good suggestion.
All right, so I believe we've answered all the questions and we've reached the end of our time today. And I just want to thank again Ellen, Lynn, and Michael for a great session, and also thank you participants for asking really great questions. As a reminder, this webinar has been recorded and will be posted on the relcentral.org website in just the next few hours. Additionally, immediately following today's event, you will be sent a request and link to complete a customer satisfaction survey on SurveyMonkey. And we ask that you take a few minutes to complete the survey in the next few days. The information gathered from these surveys helps us to identify additional offerings and make adjustments to our webinars to ensure that we are best meeting your needs in the future. We invite you to visit our website or follow our REL Central handle on Twitter, which is at REL Central, for additional information about upcoming webinars, events, and other resources that may be of assistance to you. You can also ask us research questions or join our research alliances and get involved. So thank you very much for your participation, and hope you have a great rest of the day.